So in the early 1930s, Soviet foreign policy went completely off the rails. Today, we're going to dig into how a radical ideology, a bunch of secret deals, and just a catastrophic miscalculation not only left the USSR totally isolated, but also, believe it or not, accidentally paved the way for its greatest enemy. And that brings us to this incredible paradox. How on earth did a Soviet policy, a policy that was supposed to kick off a global revolution, end up crippling the very people who might have been able to stop the rise of Nazism? The answer? Well, it's a huge lesson in unintended consequences. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the radical new doctrine that got the ball rolling. Then we'll look at who the Soviets, kind of surprisingly, decided was their main enemy. We'll uncover a secret partnership that totally contradicted what they were saying in public. Then we'll see how Hitler's rise just blew everything up. And finally, we'll check out the urgent last-minute policy change that, well, came way too late. Right, so our story really kicks off in 1928. This is when the Soviet Union, through its global arm, the Comintern, decides to get way more aggressive and confrontational with its foreign policy.
The place where it all went down was the 6th Congress of the Comintern. And listen, this wasn't just some boring meeting. Nope. This was the official launch of a whole new doctrine that would end up isolating the Soviet Union and shaking things up all across Europe, especially in Germany.
And that doctrine was called the Third Period. The main idea was pretty simple, but man was it bold. They truly believed that global capitalism was on its last legs, about to completely collapse. So for them, a worldwide communist revolution wasn't just some far-off dream. It was literally right around the corner. And that belief justified a super hardline, no-compromise approach to everything. Now, if you think a global revolution is about to happen any day now, you've got to figure out who your enemies are. And the Third Period theory led the Soviets to a pretty startling and super divisive conclusion. Okay, get this. The term they came up with for their new number one enemy was social fascism. But here's the twist. This wasn't aimed at the actual fascists. No, it was aimed at the moderate, center-left social democratic parties. Their logic was, well, kind of twisted. They thought that by trying to reform capitalism, these groups were actually stopping it from collapsing, which in the Comintern's eyes made them just as bad as the real fascists. And they weren't just blowing smoke. I mean, look at this quote from a 1929 Comintern directive. It tells communist parties to treat social democrats as instruments of fascism. This policy flat out banned any kind of cooperation, and it created this deep, bitter split on the political left all over Europe. But, okay, this is where the story gets really contradictory. Because while the Comintern was publicly declaring war on its ideological neighbors, the Soviet state was doing something very, very different behind the scenes. It was a total split personality. On one side, you have the official Comintern line. Pure ideological hostility, revolution is coming, no compromises. But on the other side, you have what was actually happening. The Soviet state was quietly keeping up its diplomatic, economic, and even military ties with Germany. It was a classic case of saying one thing and doing another. And this cooperation wasn't some minor thing. It was built on formal treaties like the ones from Rapallo and Berlin. And most importantly, it involved secret military collaboration. Get this, the Lipetsk Air Base in the Soviet Union was where the German military, which was banned from having an air force by the Treaty of Versailles, was secretly training its pilots. And this went on right up until 1933. So you've got this wild balancing act, public ideological war, private pragmatic deals. But it was all built on shaky ground. And over in Germany, a political earthquake was about to show just how dangerous this whole contradiction really was.
And you got to remember, the USSR was already pretty isolated at this point. Things like the Zinoviev letter scare in Britain back in 24 and the Arcos raid in 27 had really damaged trust with Western powers. The Third Period doctrine just made everything worse, leaving the Soviet Union with very few friends right when a huge threat was building.
And then it happens. January 1933. Adolf Hitler, a guy who absolutely despised communism, becomes Chancellor of Germany. All of a sudden, the Soviet Union's secret military partner is being led by its most vocal and dangerous enemy. For Moscow, this wasn't just a change in leadership. It was an existential threat, a real five-alarm fire. Hitler had made it crystal clear how much he hated communism and that he had big plans for expanding eastward. The whole game had just been flipped on its head overnight. Faced with this immediate, in-your-face danger, the entire foundation of Soviet foreign policy just started to crumble. The people who came up with the third period were forced into a really fast and pretty humiliating retreat. It was this dawning horror in Moscow. Wait a minute. Our own policy was a complete disaster. By forcing German communists to fight the Social Democrats, they had split the opposition to the Nazis right down the middle, making Hitler's path to power way, way easier. Their grand revolutionary strategy had backfired in the worst possible way.
So they had to scramble and rethink everything, and fast. Step 1, recognize the undeniable threat that Nazi Germany represented. Step 2, admit, at least internally, that the whole social fascism idea was a catastrophic failure. And step 3, start looking for new allies, which meant they had to go knocking on the doors of the very same social democratic parties they had just been calling their enemies.
And that was it. This was the dawn of a totally new era in Soviet policy. The ideological purity of the third period was dead and buried. It was replaced by the desperate, pragmatic strategy of the Popular Front, basically an attempt to build broad anti-fascist alliances with anyone who was willing to stand against Hitler. And that leaves us with this haunting question that historians still debate to this day. If the Comintern had pushed for cooperation instead of division, could a united front of communists and social democrats in Germany have actually stopped Hitler before he ever took power? It's a massive what if, and there's no easy answer, but it really highlights the huge historical stakes of the decisions we've just walked through.